Sometimes the saddest hearts are the ones nobody ever learns how to stay for. The German shepherd sat perfectly still behind the shelter glass, while snow drifted quietly outside the windows of Silver Pine Animal Rescue in northern Colorado. 15 families had already walked away from him in less than 3 months. 15 hopeful beginnings. 15 endings that somehow hurt worse every time. Nobody used words like cruel. Not here. The shelter volunteers tried hard. Good people always did. But disappointment still left fingerprints even when nobody meant harm. One family said the dog was distant. Another complained he did not play enough. A retired couple returned him after 3 days because he spent hours staring silently through windows instead of sleeping near the couch. Somebody even called him unsettling. Like he is thinking too much, they said. Strange complaint for a dog, but people often feared things they did not understand. Especially quiet things. Especially wounded things. The shelter staff had stopped introducing him excitedly after family number 11. By family 15, conversations sounded softer. More careful. The kind of voices people used when hope began shrinking. Ranger barely reacted anymore when visitors passed his enclosure. Other dogs barked, wagged tails, pressed eagerly against gates hoping somebody might finally choose them. Ranger simply watched. Calm, alert, patient in a way that somehow looked heavier than ordinary waiting. His black and tan coat stayed clean despite shelter life. Amber eyes moved carefully from person to person without excitement or fear. Just observation. Like somebody who had learned disappointment came quietly. Shelter manager Linda Harper stood near the intake desk that cold February morning, flipping through paperwork with tired hands wrapped around coffee already gone cold. Ranger's transfer papers sat near the top of the pile. Nobody liked talking about transfers. The shelter outside Denver had more resources, better behavioral specialists, more space. Still, the decision felt uncomfortable, like giving up on something nobody quite understood. He stopped eating again last night. Volunteer Megan whispered gently while hanging winter coats near the office heater. Linda nodded sadly. How much? Barely touched anything. Megan hesitated briefly before continuing. Only after the Henderson family left. Silence settled quietly between them. Linda glanced toward Ranger's enclosure near the far end of the shelter. The dog sat near the gate again, watching the front entrance, waiting for something nobody else could see. It is almost like he notices every goodbye, Megan said softly. Linda sighed. Maybe he does. Snow tapped gently against the windows while quiet morning routines continued around them. The shelter smelled faintly of coffee, blankets, and wet winter air. Somewhere nearby, a puppy barked happily while volunteers laughed softly. Yet somehow sadness lingered strongest near Ranger. Not dramatic sadness. Quiet sadness. The kind loneliness leaves behind after enough people stop staying. Just after 11 in the morning, the front bell above the shelter entrance chimed softly. Cold winter air slipped inside along with a tall man wearing a worn sheriff department jacket dusted lightly with snow. Officer Mason Reed looked tired in the familiar way exhaustion settles into people who stopped mentioning it years ago. 45 years old. White American male. Quiet eyes carrying too much silence. Broad shoulders softened by long shifts and longer nights. He removed his gloves slowly while glancing around the lobby. Morning, Linda called warmly. Mason nodded politely. Morning. He came here sometimes. Usually after difficult weeks. Never stayed long. Sometimes donated blankets. Sometimes walked dogs nobody wanted to walk. Never asked for much conversation. Small towns remembered quiet kindness better than loud promises. Linda smiled gently. What brings you in today? Mason hesitated slightly. Honestly, he shrugged once. Did not really want to go home yet. The honesty surprised neither of them. Mason's divorce 2 years earlier left too much silence inside a house built for more people than one. Long police shifts helped. Empty evenings did not. Linda softened slightly. Well, she said, you are welcome to stay a while. Mason nodded once before moving deeper into the shelter. Most dogs reacted instantly. Barking, wagging, pressing hopefully against kennel gates. Yet one enclosure stayed completely still. Ranger watched him approach without movement. No barking. No excitement. Just stillness. Mason slowed near the gate, hands resting quietly in his jacket pockets. The dog stared back calmly. Intelligent eyes. Too intelligent maybe. Strange thing was, Mason did not feel uncomfortable. Just understood somehow. Hey there, he said quietly. Ranger stood slowly. No sudden movement. No fear. No excitement. Then something happened nobody inside the shelter had seen before. Ranger walked directly to the front of the enclosure and sat calmly beside the gate. Close enough to stay. Close enough to matter. No hesitation. No distance. Just quiet certainty. Megan froze nearby holding folded towels. Wait, she whispered softly. Linda looked up immediately. What? Megan pointed carefully. He never does that. Mason glanced between them. Does what? Linda walked closer slowly, genuine surprise crossing her face. He usually ignores people. Ranger remained sitting near Mason without breaking eye contact. Calm. Steady. Like he recognized something familiar nobody else noticed yet. Mason crouched carefully near the gate. You having a rough week too? He asked quietly. Ranger lowered his head slightly, resting near the metal bars without fear. For reasons Mason could not explain, something inside his chest tightened unexpectedly. Not pity exactly. Recognition maybe. Like loneliness recognizing loneliness. Outside, snow continued falling gently across Silver Pine while inside the shelter, for the very first time in months, the dog everyone quietly called Broken stopped waiting near the door and finally looked like he might stay. Some connections arrive quietly, almost like they are afraid of being noticed too soon. Mason Reed stayed crouched beside the enclosure for longer than he realized while Ranger rested calmly near the gate, neither moving much, neither seeming uncomfortable with the silence. Around them, the shelter continued its usual rhythm. Puppies barked. Volunteers folded blankets. Somewhere in the back, somebody laughed softly after spilling dog treats across the floor. Yet somehow, everything near Ranger felt quieter than the rest of the building. Not sad exactly, just still. Linda Harper crossed her arms carefully as she watched from a few feet away. I do not think I have ever seen him do that, she admitted quietly. Mason looked toward her. Maybe he is just tired. Linda gave a small smile. No, she said softly. He usually keeps his distance. Ranger lowered himself gently onto the floor beside the enclosure door, never fully taking his eyes off Mason. Not needy, not demanding attention, just staying close. Strange thing was, Mason did not feel crowded. He felt understood somehow, though he could not explain why. How long did you say he has been here? Mason asked. Linda exhaled slowly. 3 months. She hesitated briefly. 15 returns. Mason glanced back toward the dog. 15. Linda nodded sadly. Nobody really knows what to do with him. Megan walked over carrying paperwork, lowering her voice instinctively near Ranger. Families say he acts distant, she explained. Too quiet. Too watchful. She offered a weak smile. One lady said he stared at her like he knew something she did not. Mason almost laughed at that. Maybe he just likes observing people. That is what we thought too, Linda said. But after enough returns, her voice faded slightly. Some disappointments became easier to stop explaining. Mason rested one hand lightly near the enclosure bars. Ranger moved closer without hesitation, lowering his head quietly near Mason's fingers. No fear, no tension, just calm trust. It surprised everyone, including Mason. He had never planned to adopt anything, especially not today. He had only stopped by because going home felt heavier than usual. His small house near Pine Creek had become too quiet after the divorce. Too many empty rooms. Too much silence stretching across evenings after long shifts. He still caught himself leaving the television on just to hear another voice sometimes. Funny how loneliness arrived quietly. Never all at once. Just one evening after another until silence stopped feeling temporary. Ranger pressed slightly closer against the bars. Mason scratched gently near one ear. The dog closed his eyes briefly, as though remembering something comforting. You got trust issues too? Mason asked quietly. Megan exchanged a glance with Linda. You know, she said carefully, we do foster weekends sometimes. Mason looked up. Foster weekends? Linda nodded. Just temporary. No pressure. She smiled gently. Sometimes dogs do better outside the shelter. Mason hesitated. Temporary sounded safer than permanent. Easier too. Less expectation. Less chance of disappointing something that already looked disappointed enough. Ranger stood slowly when Mason stepped back. Followed him along the gate. Stayed close. Mason noticed immediately. So did everybody else. He never follows people, Megan whispered softly. Linda tilted her head slightly. Maybe he picked you. Mason rubbed the back of his neck. I'm not exactly home much. Neither is anybody worth caring about, Linda said kindly. Mason laughed quietly despite himself. Something about today felt strange. Unexpected. Like walking into a room you somehow remembered without realizing why. All right, Mason finally said after a long pause. One weekend. Megan nearly smiled too fast. Really? Mason shrugged once. Weekend trial. He pointed carefully toward Ranger. No promises. Linda disappeared briefly before returning with paperwork and supplies. Food bowls. Leash. Blanket. Basic instructions nobody expected Mason to read immediately. Ranger remained unusually calm during the process. No pacing. No nervous behavior. Just waiting quietly beside the gate. Almost patient. Like somebody afraid Hope might disappear if he moved too quickly. When the enclosure finally opened, nobody inside the shelter breathed normally for several seconds. Ranger stepped out carefully. No pulling. No hesitation. He walked directly beside Mason and sat quietly near his boots. Shelter volunteers exchanged surprised looks. Well, Megan whispered softly, that is new. Snow continued falling outside, while Mason adjusted the leash awkwardly. Guess we are both figuring this out, he muttered quietly. Ranger looked up once. Calm amber eyes. Steady. Outside, cold winter air wrapped around them as they stepped into the parking lot together. Ranger paused briefly near Mason's truck, waiting instead of pulling. Another strange thing. Like he already understood how to stay near without asking for anything. Mason opened the passenger door carefully. You ever ride in trucks? Ranger climbed inside without trouble and settled quietly against the seat. No pacing. No whining. Just silence again. Familiar silence somehow. Before driving away, Mason glanced once toward the shelter entrance where Linda and Megan stood watching. Linda smiled warmly. Take your time, she called gently. Mason nodded once before pulling onto the snowy road toward Pine Creek. Beside him, Ranger rested quietly against the seat, occasionally watching the falling snow through the window. Neither knew exactly what this weekend might become yet. But for the first time in months, the dog everyone believed nobody could keep had stopped looking toward the door like somebody leaving. And somewhere beneath the quiet sound of snow brushing against the windshield, something small and fragile finally felt willing to try again. And if stories about second chances, loyal dogs, and quiet healing speak to your heart, please remember to like and subscribe so you do not miss more unforgettable stories ahead. The first night felt stranger than either of them expected. Snow followed Mason Reed home through winding mountain roads outside Pine Creek, while Ranger sat quietly in the passenger seat, never restless, never uncertain, simply watching the world move by, as though he had spent years learning how quickly things changed. Mason glanced toward him once at a stop sign near the edge of town. You always this calm? He asked quietly. Ranger looked toward him briefly, then back out the window without making a sound. Strange dog, Mason thought, but somehow not difficult. Just quiet. Like silence felt familiar to him too. Mason's house stood near the edge of a wooded neighborhood where pine trees stretched across frozen hills and winter settled deep after sunset. The place had once felt warmer. Back when lights stayed on in more than one room. Back before divorce papers arrived quietly after years of growing distance nobody ever learned how to fix. These days the house mostly echoed. A coffee mug left in the sink too long. Television playing only for background noise. Dinner usually forgotten unless hunger became impossible to ignore. Mason stepped out first, boots crunching softly across packed snow, while Ranger climbed down calmly from the truck and stood beside him. No pulling on the leash. No anxious pacing. Just patience. Like waiting had become second nature. Inside, warm air greeted them along with familiar silence. Mason dropped his keys near the kitchen counter. Well, he muttered quietly, removing his jacket. Guess this is home for the weekend. Ranger stood near the doorway for several seconds. Watching. Observing. Careful eyes moving slowly across the room. Not nervous. Not excited either. Just thoughtful somehow. Mason placed fresh water near the kitchen and filled a food bowl carefully. Shelter said you skip meals sometimes, he said. Maybe tonight goes better. Ranger approached slowly after Mason stepped back, lowered his head, ate quietly. Not quickly, not desperately, just enough to feel safe. Mason leaned against the counter watching without realizing why relief settled somewhere deep inside his chest. Strange thing to care about already. Yet something about disappointment sitting inside another living thing felt strangely familiar. Dinner came later. Leftover chili reheated in the microwave while soft winter wind brushed gently against the windows. Mason sat alone at the kitchen table like usual, except tonight somebody else occupied the room. Ranger settled quietly a few feet away near the empty chair nobody used anymore. The chair Mason stopped looking at directly after his ex-wife moved out nearly 2 years ago. Ranger never begged for food, never barked, never demanded attention, just stayed nearby, present, calm. Somehow that felt heavier than noise ever could. You know, Mason said after several quiet minutes, most people think silence means something is wrong. Ranger lifted one ear slightly. Truth is, Mason continued softly, staring down into his untouched dinner. Sometimes silence is just all somebody has left. Outside, snow continued falling gently while warmth settled through the house in quiet layers. For the first time in months, Mason did not turn the television on immediately after dinner. Strange. He usually hated silence. Tonight it felt different somehow. Less empty. Later that evening, Mason carried extra blankets into the laundry room near the kitchen where he prepared a sleeping spot for Ranger. Nothing fancy, he said quietly, but warm. Ranger stepped inside, looked around, then calmly walked back out and settled near Mason's bedroom door instead. Mason blinked once. You serious? Ranger rested his head against his paws without moving. All right then, Mason muttered quietly. Guess you made your decision. Sometime after midnight, sleep arrived harder than usual. Winter storms always made Mason restless. Too much noise against the roof. Too much memory buried inside long nights. Around 3 in the morning, he woke suddenly from another bad dream he never fully remembered afterward. Just flashes, heavy breathing, familiar loneliness sitting sharp inside his chest. For several quiet moments, he stared toward darkness, trying to steady himself. Then came something unexpected. Soft movement outside the bedroom door. Mason opened it slowly. Ranger sat there already awake. Calm. Waiting. Not anxious. Not demanding anything. Just present. Like he somehow knew. Mason crouched carefully beside him. You hear me moving around? He asked softly. Ranger leaned slightly closer without fear. Mason rubbed tired hands across his face before resting briefly against the hallway wall. Bad nights happen sometimes, he admitted quietly. Guess we both got history. Ranger remained beside him. No noise. No pressure. Just quiet company at 3 in the morning when loneliness usually felt loudest. Morning arrived softly through pale mountain sunlight spreading across snowy windows. Mason woke later than usual and stepped carefully into the kitchen, expecting unfamiliar awkwardness. Instead, Ranger already sat quietly nearby, watching snow drift outside like he belonged there somehow. Coffee brewed while cold morning light filled the room. Mason paused beside the window, strange realization settling slowly inside him. For the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, the house no longer felt completely empty. And somehow, without trying too hard or asking for much at all, the dog everyone gave up on had already started noticing the parts of Mason Reed nobody else seemed to see anymore. By Sunday afternoon, something subtle had already changed inside Mason Reed's house. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to notice in quiet moments. Coffee tasted less rushed. Evenings felt shorter somehow. Silence still existed, but it no longer pressed quite so hard against the walls. Ranger settled into routines without being asked. Every morning, the German Shepherd sat quietly near the kitchen window while Mason made coffee, watching snowfall gather softly across pine branches as though winter itself carried secrets only patient things understood. He never begged for food, never barked unnecessarily, never paced the floors like nervous shelter dogs often did. Instead, Ranger simply stayed near, present without pressure, careful without distance. It unsettled Mason slightly how natural the dog already felt inside the house. Sunday evening arrived cold and quiet beneath heavy gray skies when Mason clipped on Ranger's leash before leaving for patrol. You staying home feels risky, he muttered quietly while grabbing his jacket. Besides, maybe you need fresh air. Ranger stood immediately beside the front door as though already prepared. No resistance. No excitement either. Just calm readiness. The Pine Creek Police Department worked differently than city stations. Smaller town. Longer quiet stretches. Everybody knew everybody. Officer Mason Reed spent most shifts checking roads, helping stranded drivers, responding to occasional disputes that usually ended with apologies and embarrassed silence. Tonight promised another slow winter patrol. Ranger sat calmly in the back seat of the cruiser while mountain roads stretched endlessly beneath soft snowfall. At first, everything felt ordinary. Quiet roads, dim storefront lights, snow gathering near sidewalks downtown. Mason even caught himself talking occasionally. Strange habit. Town diner makes terrible coffee after 6, he said while driving past Main Street. Ranger remained quietly observant behind him. People pretend otherwise because Mary gives free pie sometimes. Somewhere between silence and snowfall, Mason almost smiled. Strange how easy conversation felt when nobody interrupted. Around 8:30, Mason slowed near St. Andrew's Church on the north side of town, an older brick building sitting quietly near abandoned storage units and narrow alleyways most people ignored after dark. Ranger shifted suddenly in the back seat. Not anxious. Alert. Mason noticed immediately. What is it? Ranger stood now, ears raised slightly, amber eyes fixed toward a narrow alley beside the church parking lot. Mason slowed briefly, looked around. Nothing unusual. Just drifting snow and flickering streetlight shadows. Probably nothing, Mason said gently. Ranger remained standing, watching. They continued driving. 20 minutes later, after helping an elderly couple with a dead battery near Main Street, Mason passed St. Andrews again on the return route. This time Ranger reacted sooner. Sat forward immediately, quiet but focused, eyes locked toward the same alley. Mason frowned slightly. Again, Ranger gave no sound, just watched. Steady, intentional somehow. Mason slowed the cruiser again before eventually shaking his head. You really do not like that spot. Still, nothing looked wrong. Snow-covered sidewalks. Wind pushed gently through narrow spaces between buildings. Quiet mountain town things. Yet something lingered strangely in Mason's thoughts afterward. Around 10:30, freezing temperatures dropped fast across Pine Creek. Dispatch radio crackled softly through the cruiser speakers while Ranger remained unusually attentive. Mason turned near St. Andrews for the third time that evening. Before the vehicle fully passed the alley, Ranger stood immediately and gave the first quiet sound Mason had heard from him all weekend. Not barking, more like low concern. Soft, controlled, enough to stop Mason instantly. All right, Mason muttered quietly. You win. He parked carefully near the church lot and stepped into bitter cold winter air. Snow crunched beneath boots while Ranger moved ahead calmly, not pulling, simply walking with purpose. The alley stretched narrow between old brick walls and storage sheds dusted with snow. At first, Mason saw nothing except scattered boxes and forgotten winter debris. Then Ranger slowed, stopped beside stacked wooden pallets near the far corner. Mason stepped closer. Something moved faintly beneath blankets. Human shape. Thin. Still. Sir. Mason called gently, lowering himself carefully. An older man slowly stirred beneath heavy layers of worn clothing. Face pale from cold, beard touched with frost. A shopping cart stood nearby, carrying almost everything somebody could still call home. Ranger lowered himself quietly beside the man without fear. Calm. Gentle. The older man blinked weakly. Did not mean trouble, he said quietly through tired breath. Mason shook his head immediately. You are all right. He noticed trembling hands. Cold far too deep for safety. How long have you been out here? The older man hesitated. Few days. Ranger rested quietly nearby, staying close but respectful. Somehow calmer than most people would have been. Mason noticed something then. Worn military cap resting near the blankets. Army veteran insignia faded with age. Something inside Mason tightened unexpectedly. You served? He asked softly. The man nodded faintly. Long time ago. Snow continued falling gently while silence settled around them. Ranger looked briefly toward Mason again, almost as though reminding him this was why they stopped. Not mystery, not coincidence, just somebody hurting quietly where nobody else had thought to look. Mason removed his gloves carefully. Let us get you someplace warm, he said softly. And for the first time since Ranger entered his life, Mason began wondering whether the dog people called damaged had actually been trying to tell somebody something important all along. The warmth inside St. Andrew's community shelter arrived slowly, almost carefully, like kindness itself had learned not to move too fast around wounded people. Mason Reed sat quietly near the far corner, while an elderly volunteer carried blankets toward the older veteran ranger had found beneath the alley shelter. The man introduced himself only as Walter Green, 72 years old, former Army mechanic, pride still visible even through exhaustion. Ranger remained near Walter's chair during the first hour, never crowding him, simply staying close enough to matter. Strange thing was, Walter relaxed faster around the dog than anyone else. He reminds me of one I knew overseas, Walter said softly while warming his hands around coffee somebody insisted tasted better than hospital coffee. Quiet dogs usually notice things before people do. Ranger rested calmly beside him, head lowered near worn boots as snow continued falling outside the shelter windows. Mason watched quietly from nearby, unable to stop thinking about how determined Ranger had seemed in that alley. 3 times in one night. Same location. Same concern. Like the dog had understood something Mason missed. Around midnight, after making sure Walter had somewhere warm to sleep and enough food for morning, Mason finally stepped back outside into freezing mountain air. Ranger followed beside him without leash tension, moving with familiar calm. Snow drifted softly beneath dim parking lot lights while Pine Creek rested quietly under winter silence. Mason opened the cruiser door before pausing briefly beside Ranger. "You knew somebody was there," he said quietly. Ranger looked toward him, ears slightly raised. Calm expression. No need for praise. No excitement. Just stillness again. Mason exhaled slowly. "Guess I owe you one." Back home, the house felt warmer than usual. Maybe because silence no longer felt quite as empty. Ranger settled near the fireplace while Mason reheated leftover soup near midnight, exhaustion finally beginning to settle into tired shoulders. Strange thing about helping somebody else was how often it softened things inside yourself too. Mason found himself thinking about Walter more than expected. How loneliness sometimes made people disappear quietly, especially older men, especially veterans. Towns noticed missing dogs before lonely people sometimes. Sad truth nobody liked saying out loud. Ranger remained stretched calmly near the rug, while Mason ate slowly in unusual silence. Eventually, Mason reached down absent-mindedly, resting one hand gently against warm fur. "You really saw him," he said softly. "Did not you?" Ranger barely moved except for slight tail movement against the floor. Enough to answer. Monday morning arrived cold and bright across Pine Creek. Snow still covered sidewalks while sunlight spilled gently across frozen roads. Mason dropped Ranger back at Silver Pine Animal Rescue before his afternoon paperwork shift, though something about leaving the dog behind unsettled him unexpectedly. Ranger walked quietly through shelter doors without resistance. Those shelter volunteers immediately noticed something unusual. The dog did not go sit near the entrance anymore. Instead, he kept watching Mason, following him with careful amber eyes. Waiting. Linda Harper folded her arms while studying the interaction carefully. "Well," she said softly, "that is different." Mason looked confused. "What?" Megan smiled from nearby. "He usually shuts down after foster weekends." Linda nodded. "Sometimes stops eating again." Her expression softened. "He looks calmer today." Ranger remained standing near Mason's side. No fear. No distance. Just quiet certainty. Mason rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Weekend went all right." Linda raised an eyebrow slightly. "Only all right." Mason hesitated. Hard to explain something that sounded strange even in his own head. "He is different." Megan smiled knowingly. "Good different." Mason glanced toward Ranger again. Like he notices things. Linda exchanged a quiet look with Megan. "Funny thing," she said carefully. "Nobody ever thought he was aggressive." She paused briefly. "Just sad." Something about the word landed heavier than Mason expected. Sad. Not difficult. Not broken. Just carrying something nobody else understood. Before leaving, Mason crouched briefly near Ranger. "I got work," he said quietly. "But I will check on you later." Ranger stepped closer immediately. Calm. Present. Like leaving felt familiar in ways neither of them liked admitting. Mason stood slowly. "Hey," Megan called softly as he turned toward the door. "You should probably know something." Mason stopped. "What?" Megan hesitated briefly before speaking. "He ate breakfast this morning." Linda smiled gently. First full meal after foster pickup in weeks. Silence followed. Mason looked briefly toward Ranger again. Strange tightening settling quietly inside his chest. like responsibility mixed with something softer he had not felt in a long time. Connection, maybe. Outside, cold air met him again while snow crunched beneath boots. Yet halfway to his cruiser, something made him pause. Through the shelter window, Ranger still sat watching him. Calm, patient, waiting, not desperate, not afraid, just hopeful enough to try again. And for reasons Mason could not fully explain yet, driving away suddenly felt harder than it should have. Tuesday arrived colder than usual across Pine Creek, the kind of mountain morning where snow hardened against rooftops and frozen air slipped quietly through every crack old houses forgot how to seal. Mason Reed stood near his kitchen window with untouched coffee cooling slowly beside him while winter light stretched pale across empty rooms. Something about yesterday refused to leave his thoughts. Ranger sitting behind shelter glass. Ranger watching him drive away. Ranger finding Walter beneath freezing shadows nobody else noticed. Strange thing was, Mason had spent years learning how not to miss things. Police work trained people for that. Yet somehow a dog everyone else misunderstood had already noticed something he nearly drove past 3 separate times. Mason exhaled quietly and rubbed tired hands together. You are thinking about him, he muttered to himself before shaking his head. Ridiculous thought maybe. But loneliness made strange things feel important, especially after enough quiet years. By late afternoon, patrol ended earlier than expected after snowfall worsened road conditions. Mason parked outside Silver Pine Animal Rescue without entirely admitting to himself why he came back so quickly. Maybe to check on the dog. Maybe because the house felt emptier again. Maybe because something inside him quietly hoped Ranger might still look toward the door the same way. Shelter warmth greeted him immediately alongside familiar sounds of barking, soft volunteer voices, and coffee brewing somewhere near the office. Linda Harper looked up from paperwork and smiled knowingly before he even spoke. That was fast, she said gently. Mason shrugged once. Had time. Linda smiled like she understood more than she said. He has been waiting near the front since lunch. Something unexpectedly heavy shifted inside Mason's chest. Waiting. Funny word. Dangerous word too if somebody had spent enough years disappointed. Mason followed Linda toward the back kennels where soft winter light filtered through narrow windows. Most dogs barked excitedly as he passed. Ranger did not bark. He simply stood immediately the moment Mason appeared, calm amber eyes steady, posture relaxed but attentive. Then something happened that made even Linda pause. Ranger walked directly toward the gate and rested quietly against it without hesitation. Like relief arrived without needing explanation. Mason crouched slowly. Hey buddy, he said quietly. Ranger lowered his head gently near Mason's hand. Calm. Familiar already somehow. Linda folded her arms softly nearby. He barely touched breakfast after you left yesterday. Mason frowned slightly. But Megan said, he finished dinner after your visit, Linda explained. Ate lunch too. She paused briefly. Truth is, he seems different when you are here. Mason looked toward Ranger again. The dog remained still, quietly watching him the way lonely people sometimes watch doors after somebody finally visits. You ever figure out his history? Mason asked quietly. Linda hesitated. Actually, she motioned toward the office. Come with me. 10 minutes later, Mason sat across from Linda while snow drifted gently outside shelter windows. Ranger rested nearby on the floor for the first time instead of staying inside the kennel. Nobody stopped him. Somehow it already felt natural. Linda opened an old shelter file folder worn soft around the edges. We finally got access to records from his previous county, she said quietly. Mason leaned forward slightly. What happened? Linda exhaled carefully before speaking. Ranger belonged to a retired military K-9 trainer named Thomas Beckett. She slid an old photograph across the desk. Gray-haired man. Warm smile. Ranger younger, but unmistakable beside him. Mason studied the picture quietly. They were together almost 5 years, Linda continued softly. Then Mr. Beckett passed away unexpectedly. Silence settled briefly. Ranger remained resting nearby, head lowered against his paws. Calm. Listening somehow. Family members could not keep him, Linda explained. After that, she paused sadly. Everything got harder. Failed adoption after failed adoption. Families expecting playful energy from a dog, still grieving somebody he trusted. Complaints misunderstood as behavior problems. Quietness mistaken for emotional damage. Sadness mistaken for something broken. Mason looked toward Ranger slowly. Something uncomfortable settled inside him now. Recognition again. Too familiar. Because grief changed people too. Made them quieter. More distant. Harder to understand unless somebody stayed long enough to notice. He was not broken, Mason said quietly after several seconds. Linda shook her head gently. No, her voice softened. I think he was heartbroken. The room grew strangely quiet after that. Outside, snow touched shelter windows softly while volunteers moved quietly through evening routines. Mason rested both hands together, staring briefly toward nothing. Funny thing about hearing somebody else's loneliness described honestly was how often it sounded familiar. Divorce had not broken Mason exactly, but it changed things. Trust felt heavier afterward. Silence stayed longer. Nights stretched wider. Somewhere along the way, he stopped expecting company to remain. Ranger stood slowly, then, and crossed the room without hurry. No excitement. No dramatic moment. Just quiet movement. He settled gently beside Mason's chair, resting close enough to stay. Mason looked down. One hand reached instinctively toward warm fur. Guess we both know something about people leaving, he said quietly. Ranger stayed exactly where he was. No fear. No hesitation. Just calm presence. And for the first time in longer than Mason wanted to admit, the idea of going home alone suddenly felt like the lonelier option. By the end of the week, Ranger had quietly become part of Mason Reed's routine in ways neither of them seemed fully prepared to admit out loud. Foster paperwork still sat unfinished on the kitchen counter beside unopened mail and cold coffee cups. Yet somehow the German Shepherd already moved through the house like he understood where silence lived and how not to disturb it. Every morning began almost the same now. Mason waking before sunrise. Coffee brewing softly in the kitchen. Snow resting heavily across Pine Creek, while Ranger sat patiently near the window, watching winter wake slowly beyond the glass. He still never barked much, never demanded attention, but he noticed everything. The nights had changed most. Mason still woke sometimes from restless dreams he rarely remembered clearly. Yet somehow Ranger always seemed to know before he fully opened his eyes. Quiet footsteps outside the bedroom door. Calm presence in the hallway. Never dramatic. Never needy. Just there. Like loneliness became easier to carry when somebody else stayed awake with it. Friday afternoon arrived brighter than expected after nearly a week of storms. Sunlight reflected sharply against melting snowbanks while Pine Creek slowly returned to normal rhythms. Mason finished paperwork at the station before clipping Ranger's leash for a short walk through downtown. You could use practice being social, Mason muttered quietly. Ranger walked calmly beside him. No pulling. No nervous pacing. Just steady movement, attentive without fear. People noticed immediately. Small towns always did. Mary from the diner leaned halfway out the front door, carrying fresh bread deliveries. Well, look at you, she called warmly. You finally got yourself company. Mason rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Temporary. Mary raised an eyebrow knowingly. Sure it is. Ranger sat calmly near Mason's boots while Mary crouched carefully nearby. Handsome boy, she whispered softly. Ranger remained relaxed. No fear. No tension. Just watching. That shelter dog? She asked. Mason nodded once. His name is Ranger. Mary smiled gently. Looks like he picked the right person. Strange sentence. Somehow uncomfortable and comforting at the same time. They continued walking past storefronts while afternoon sunlight softened mountain shadows across Main Street. Then something changed. Near the old hardware store, voices carried sharply through the cold air. Not panic exactly. Worried. Tense. Mason slowed immediately. A small crowd gathered near the edge of Town Park where snow-covered trees stretched across frozen walking paths. Ranger stood more alert now. Calm but focused. A woman stood near the entrance, visibly shaken, speaking quickly to Officer Carla Benson from day shift. She just ran, the woman said anxiously. I only looked away for a second. Mason approached quietly. What happened? Carla looked relieved seeing him. 8-year-old girl wandered off during park cleanup. She lowered her voice slightly. Autism spectrum. Gets overwhelmed easily. Mason scanned the park immediately. Snow covered nearly everything. Trails stretching farther into quiet wooded sections. Wind growing colder by the hour. How long? He asked. 20 minutes. Mason frowned slightly. Enough time to matter in winter temperatures. Ranger stood unusually still beside him now, ears raised slightly. watching the tree line. Carla sighed quietly. Search volunteers are coming. Before Mason could answer, Ranger moved suddenly. Not running, just walking with quiet certainty toward a narrow wooded path near the far edge of the park. Mason blinked once. Ranger. The dog paused briefly, looked back, then continued toward the trees. Calm, purposeful. Mason exchanged a glance with Carla. You seeing this? Carla nodded slowly. Honestly, she said. At this point, I trust anything paying attention. Mason followed carefully, boots sinking into soft snow while Ranger moved steadily ahead without leash pulling. No panic, no confusion, just focus. The wooded trail narrowed quickly beneath pine branches heavy with snow. Wind softened here. Silence deeper. After several minutes, Ranger slowed. Stopped near a fallen log beside frozen brush. At first Mason saw nothing. Then movement. Small figure curled quietly beneath winter coat near the tree line. Young girl. Knees tucked close. Crying softly into her sleeves. Ranger lowered himself immediately several feet away. Calm posture. No sudden movement. No barking. Just presence. The girl looked up slowly. Fear softened almost instantly seeing the dog resting quietly nearby. Doggy, she whispered softly. Ranger remained perfectly still. Patient somehow. Mason crouched carefully several feet away. Gentle voice. Hey, sweetheart, he said quietly. Everybody has been looking for you. The little girl looked overwhelmed, but calmer now. One gloved hand slowly reached toward Ranger. The German shepherd stayed still, allowing trust to arrive at her pace. He found me, she asked softly. Mason glanced briefly toward the dog. Looks like he did. 20 minutes later, back near town park entrance, relieved tears and quiet gratitude spread through gathered volunteers, while Ranger sat calmly near Mason as though nothing extraordinary happened. Carla crossed her arms beside them, shaking her head slightly. Funny, she said quietly. Shelter volunteers told me nobody wanted this dog. Mason looked down toward Ranger resting quietly against his leg. Something protective settled unexpectedly inside him then. Think people misunderstood him, he said softly. Nearby, somebody snapped a photo while townspeople whispered quietly about the calm German shepherd who somehow seemed to notice people others missed. But Ranger paid none of it much attention. He only sat close beside the quiet man who, without realizing it yet, had already stopped feeling quite so alone. Snow melted slower across Pine Creek after that day in the park, but somehow people warmed faster. Small towns had a quiet way of remembering kindness, especially the kind that arrived unexpectedly. By Monday morning, the story had already traveled farther than Mason Reed preferred. The hardware store owner mentioned it while buying coffee. Mary from the diner placed an extra slice of apple pie in a paper bag for the hero dog. Somebody at the gas station even taped a printed photograph near the register showing Ranger sitting calmly beside the rescued little girl while evening snow drifted softly around them. Mason noticed Ranger receiving something unfamiliar now whenever they walked downtown. Smiles. Recognition. Gentle voices from strangers who once barely noticed him. Funny thing was, Ranger handled attention the same way he handled everything else. Quietly. Calmly. No excitement. No fear. Just patience. Yet something inside Mason remained careful. Maybe too careful. Because temporary things had always felt safer than permanent ones. Tuesday afternoon brought an unexpected meeting at the station. Police Chief Howard Ellis stood near Mason's desk holding paperwork and the serious expression older men wore when pretending opportunities did not also feel complicated. Got a minute? Howard asked quietly. Mason leaned back slightly. Depends. Howard smiled faintly. City office reached out. Mason frowned. About what? Colorado Springs. Howard placed paperwork carefully on the desk. Community Outreach Division. Better salary. Better hours. More advancement. Less isolation. Mason stared silently for several moments while Ranger rested quietly beneath the desk, head near Mason's boots. You serious? Mason finally asked. Howard nodded. Truth is, Reed, you have earned it. He hesitated briefly. Fresh start kind of thing. Funny phrase. Fresh start. Sounded hopeful when people said it. But Mason had learned something uncomfortable after divorce. Sometimes starting over only meant carrying old loneliness somewhere unfamiliar. That evening, snow softened into cold rain outside, while Mason sat quietly at his kitchen table reading transfer paperwork beside untouched dinner. Ranger rested near the old fireplace, occasionally lifting his head whenever paper shifted or silence grew too long. Better pay, new town, more opportunity. Everything practical made sense. Yet something inside him felt strangely unsettled. Would not even be a question a year ago, Mason muttered quietly. Ranger looked toward him immediately. Mason exhaled slowly. Back then, leaving sounded easier. He glanced around the house. Same quiet walls. Same rooms filled with too much memory. Yet somehow they no longer felt empty. Ranger stood slowly, then crossed the room before settling quietly beside Mason's chair. Calm. Present. Mason rested one hand absent-mindedly against warm fur. Problem is, he said quietly, I do not exactly know what happens to you. Foster agreements stayed temporary. Shelter policies complicated permanent placement paperwork. Colorado Springs apartments did not exactly welcome large dogs, especially dogs with complicated histories. Ranger stayed still. No reaction except quiet presence. Somehow that made everything harder. Wednesday brought another surprise. Mason stopped by Silver Pine Animal Rescue after work only to find Linda Harper organizing donation boxes near the office. Ranger remained beside him while volunteers moved around with familiar warmth. Linda smiled immediately seeing them together. Well, she said softly, looks official already. Mason gave a small shrug. Not exactly. Something in his voice must have shifted because Linda studied him more carefully. What happened? Mason hesitated before finally speaking. Got offered transfer work. Linda nodded slowly. Big decision. Mason glanced briefly toward Ranger. Feels complicated. Linda followed his gaze toward the dog resting calmly nearby. Because of him, Mason remained quiet several seconds before answering honestly. Yeah. Linda smiled gently, then walked toward an old bulletin board covered with adoption photographs. Families. Dogs. Second chances frozen inside frames. You know something? She said quietly. Most people think rescue works one direction. Mason frowned slightly. Linda continued softly. Truth is, sometimes animals save people too. Ranger looked briefly toward Mason, then rested again. Calm as always. He stopped waiting by the door, Linda added quietly. Mason blinked once. What? After you, she said gently. Before foster weekends, he always watched doors. She paused briefly, like somebody might come back. Snow tapped lightly against the shelter windows, while silence settled carefully between them. Linda folded her arms softly. Now, she smiled faintly. He mostly waits for your truck. Something unexpectedly painful moved quietly through Mason's chest. Hope. Dangerous thing sometimes. Especially when something trusted you again. That night at home, rain tapped softly against dark windows while Mason sat near the fireplace long after midnight. Transfer papers untouched nearby. Ranger rested asleep beside him, breathing steady beneath soft yellow light. Mason looked down quietly. Funny how fast companionship arrived when nobody forced it. No speeches, no promises, just small things. Morning coffee, shared silence. Somebody waiting outside the bedroom door after bad nights. Somebody staying. Mason leaned back slowly, eyes lingering toward Ranger longer than usual. Truth is, he said quietly into the darkness, I think you rescued me first. Ranger barely stirred, tail moving once against the floor before settling again. Outside, winter rain continued softly through Pine Creek, while somewhere deep inside a house that had spent too long feeling empty, the idea of leaving suddenly stopped sounding like freedom. Spring arrived quietly in Pine Creek, the way healing often does when nobody is paying close enough attention to notice exactly when things begin changing. Snow slowly disappeared from sidewalks. Pine trees softened beneath warmer light. Coffee cups stayed longer on diner tables, while people opened windows again after months of winter silence. Somehow, without planning it, Mason, Reed, and Ranger became part of the town's rhythm. By early March, foster paperwork no longer sat unfinished on the kitchen counter. Mason signed the adoption papers on a quiet Thursday morning without ceremony. No dramatic speech. No life-changing announcement. Just a simple signature and one quiet sentence spoken while Ranger rested calmly near his boots inside Linda Harper's office. Guess you were stuck with me now, Mason said softly. Ranger lifted his head once, calm amber eyes steady as always, before resting again like staying had never really been in question. Linda smiled quietly while sliding finalized paperwork into a folder. Funny thing, she said gently. You are his 16th home. Mason frowned slightly. 16th. Linda nodded. First one that feels permanent. Strange sentence. Heavy sentence too. Because somewhere deep inside himself, Mason quietly realized something uncomfortable and beautiful at the same time. Ranger had not only stopped waiting near shelter doors. Mason had stopped waiting for loneliness to leave too. He stopped turning the television on just to fill silence. Stopped eating dinner, standing over the kitchen counter. Stopped pretending empty rooms did not feel empty. Some evenings now looked surprisingly simple. Ranger resting near the fireplace. Coffee growing cold while mountain rain tapped softly against windows. Quiet companionship without pressure. Funny how healing sometimes arrived disguised as ordinary days. One Saturday morning, Mason drove Ranger to St. Andrew's Community Center, where Walter Green now volunteered after local veterans services helped him find temporary housing. Walter looked healthier these days. Warmer too. Less invisible somehow. Ranger recognized him immediately and walked calmly forward without hesitation. Walter smiled wider than Mason had ever seen before. There is my old soul, Walter said warmly, kneeling slowly despite stiff knees. Ranger lowered himself calmly beside him. Familiar. Safe. Mason stood quietly nearby watching something soften inside the room without anybody saying much at all. Walter scratched gently behind Ranger's ears. Funny thing, he said softly, glancing toward Mason. Some creatures only trust once. Mason nodded quietly. Yeah. Walter smiled gently. Looks like he chose right. Word traveled slowly after that. Pine Creek Community Center eventually asked if Mason and Ranger might visit occasionally during veterans support mornings. No formal program. Nothing official. Just coffee. Quiet conversations. Company for people who stopped expecting visitors. Ranger somehow understood immediately. He sat patiently beside older men carrying stories too heavy for ordinary silence. Rested near lonely widows who missed hearing somebody move through the house. Stayed beside nervous children during difficult afternoons without needing attention for any of it. People trusted him because he never asked anything in return. Weeks later, Mary from the diner hung a framed picture near the register. Ranger sitting calmly beside the little girl from the park while snow drifted softly around them. Below the photo sat a handwritten sign. Sometimes healing arrives on 4 quiet feet. Mason pretended not to notice customers smiling every time they walked in. Some afternoons still felt difficult. Healing never moved perfectly. There were nights Mason woke from old dreams again. Moments loneliness returned unexpectedly. Days Ranger seemed quieter too, maybe remembering things he still carried from before. But neither felt quite as alone anymore. That changed everything. One afternoon near the start of spring, Mason stopped by Silver Pine Animal Rescue carrying donated supplies in the back of his truck. Ranger walked calmly beside him through familiar doors while volunteers greeted them like old friends. Near the front office, Mason paused unexpectedly beside an updated shelter wall display. New photographs covered the space now. Dogs adopted. Families reunited. Second chances framed carefully against soft colors. Near the center hung Ranger's picture. Calm expression. Familiar amber eyes. Beneath the photograph, somebody had added a small handwritten note. Not broken. Just waiting for somebody who would finally stay. Mason stood quietly for several moments. Something unexpectedly tight settled inside his chest again. Not sadness exactly. Gratitude maybe. Linda appeared beside him carrying paperwork. Fits him, she said softly. Mason nodded after a long pause. Yeah. Ranger rested calmly against his leg, patient as always. Outside, spring sunlight stretched warmly across Pine Creek, while distant wind moved gently through pine trees no longer covered in snow. Mason looked down briefly toward the dog who had once been returned 15 times simply for grieving too quietly. Funny thing was, the whole town nearly missed what mattered most about him. He had never been broken, just heartbroken. And maybe that was true for people too sometimes. Maybe some souls only looked damaged because too many others walked away too soon. Maybe healing had less to do with fixing and more to do with staying. Mason rested one hand gently against Ranger's shoulder before quietly opening the shelter door toward home. And for the first time and longer than either of them probably remembered, neither one looked back wondering who might leave next.